A suspicious crash in Colorado. A night to remember. In the vast wilderness of Colorado, where winding mountain roads carve through rugged landscapes and whisper secrets only the wind carries, a chilling mystery unfolded one dark, silent night. It was mid-March when the chilling stillness of the Rocky Mountains was shattered by the glow of flickering flames drowning in the abyss of a steep ravine. It was 2:47 a.m. when Mike Thompson, a grizzled trucker with 30 years of cross-country hauls under his belt, was driving his semi through Dead Man's Pass, one of the most notorious and desolate stretches of road in the western United States. The air was biting cold, slicing through the gaps of his aging cab truck as the radio hummed an old country tune. Out of habit, Mike always kept an eye on the road ahead and another on the shoulders of the narrow mountain path. He'd heard enough stories of vehicles that had either vanished into the ravine below or re-emerged as mangled wrecks upon the cliffs. That's when he saw it. An orange glow in the rearview mirror, a dance of light so faint it might have been mistaken for the moon breaking through the clouds, but something in his gut, a trucker's sixth sense honed after decades on the road, told him this was no illusion. He tapped the brakes, his semi grudgingly slowing to a halt with a low groan. Pulling over to the shoulder, Mike climbed out into the cold, his boots crunching against the gravel as he adjusted his worn flannel jacket against the wind. Could just be a bonfire, he muttered to himself, squinting down into the pitch-black ravine below. But his gut didn't buy it. Grabbing his flashlight from the cab, he made his way toward the faint orange glow clawing at the edges of the darkness. Soon, the acrid stench of smoke filled the air. Hiking cautiously down the rocky slope, his flashlight beam eventually fell upon the source of the eerie light. A twisted hunk of metal, its once shiny silver surface charred black, perched awkwardly between jagged rocks. Fire crackled weakly from the engine, licking at the night as if gasping for its final breath. The vehicle, barely recognizable as an SUV, lay like a broken beast, its glass shattered and tires flattened. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed out, his voice trembling, not from the cold but from the horror unfolding before his eyes. His flashlight swept across the wreckage, and there, still strapped into the driver's seat, was what had once been a person. Their body was unrecognizable, scorched to the bone, the smell of burned flesh now mingling with the smoke and oil in the air. The heat radiating from the shell of the vehicle made it impossible to get closer, but that didn't stop Mike from trying. "Hey! Hey, can you hear me?" he called out almost reflexively, knowing full well no response would come. But it wasn't just the sight of death that unsettled him. There was something off about it all. The vehicle's alignment, slightly off-kilter as if it hadn't tumbled naturally. The absence of skid marks or smashed guardrails where the SUV should have veered off the road. And most eerie of all, the unnatural precision of the fire itself, as if someone had helped it along. Mike scrambled back to his semi and grabbed his bulky old cell phone. Flipping it open, he muttered curses as he glanced at the screen. No signal. Out here amid the isolation of Dead Man's Pass, there wasn't a tower in sight. "Damn it," he growled before hopping into the cab and driving another 10 miles toward a small diner back in the valley, where he finally found service and dialed 911. By the time the authorities reached the scene an hour later, the fire had burned itself out, leaving behind only the haunting skeleton of the SUV and its charred occupant. Sheriff Ethan McCall, a rugged man whose boots had stomped through 100-foot snowdrifts and gritty bar fights alike, surveyed the crash site with a tight-knit brow. The absence of crash debris along the roadside immediately caught his attention. "Doesn't make sense," he murmured, tugging his Stetson lower as the dawn began breaking over the peaks. Next to him, Deputy Lena Parker adjusted her vest, holding a steaming cup of coffee that didn't seem to make the imagery before her any less chilling. "Think it's just a drunk driver who lost control?" she offered, albeit hesitantly. Sheriff McCall shook his head slowly. "If this was just an accident, there'd be tire marks, a skid at least. But here?" He gestured toward the untouched roadside foliage. "Whoever, or whatever, went over that cliff didn't try to stop." As dawn crept across the horizon, wrapping the Rockies in hues of orange and pink, the scene came into full view, the destructive beauty of the crash offset by the serene wilderness surrounding it. The investigators knew they had stumbled onto something bigger. What looked like a tragic accident at first glance was beginning to unravel beneath their scrutiny. What Mike, Sheriff McCall, and the Colorado Coroner's Office would soon uncover wasn't just the mystery of who the charred remains in the SUV belonged to. It was a puzzle, far more complex, filled with layers of deception, greed, and calculations so cold they'd outlast even the chill of Dead Man's Pass. Tragedy or calculated fraud? As investigators began to peel back the layers of the supposed accident, they quickly discovered that nothing about the crash was as simple as it seemed. The charred vehicle in the Colorado ravine wasn't just another tragic statistic of reckless mountain driving, it was the beginning of a story twisted with deceit, desperation, and chilling precision. Sarah Middleton, the supposed victim, wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to be at the center of a deadly accident, or any accident for that matter. At 29 years old, she was a well-regarded author in Denver, known for her sharp wit, her enigmatic smile, and the mysterious allure that surrounded her life. She had no known enemies, no financial distress, and no reputation for reckless behavior. When news of her death broke, friends and colleagues alike were baffled, but grief turned to disbelief when a cold, hard question surfaced. Was Sarah Middleton even in that SUV? That question was first posed by Madison Insurance Group, the company set to pay out her $5 million life insurance policy. Just 3 months before the incident, Sarah had increased her life insurance premium drastically. Not only that, but the sole beneficiary listed on the new policy was her estranged older brother, Jake Middleton, a man known more for his debts than his family ties. Jake, a former bartender turned professional gambler, was not exactly considered the most trustworthy or close confidant in Sarah's life, which begged the question, why him? Janice Adler, the senior investigator for Madison Insurance, was one of the first to voice formal suspicion. She had seen her fair share of fraudulent claims, phony accidents, exaggerated injuries, and even staged deaths, but something about Sarah's case reeked of meticulous planning. Timing this delicate doesn't just happen by chance, Janice told her assistant during their review. Nobody just randomly increases their life insurance by millions 3 months before careening off a mountain road. Not without a very, very good reason. Still, the evidence was maddeningly ambiguous. Based on Sarah's dental records, the coroner initially believed the charred remains belonged to her. But it didn't take long for red flags to appear. The body didn't match Sarah's physical profile in subtle but significant ways. The victim had a surgical scar on her abdomen, something Sarah's medical records didn't reflect. Even stranger, the victim's height was an inch taller than Sarah's listed 5'6" in official documents. 1 or 2 discrepancies were easy to overlook, but this felt deliberate. Bodies don't get taller in death, Sheriff McCall muttered during his briefing with the local investigators. Either our victim's identity is wrong or we've got ourselves a ghost. But the irregularities didn't end there. Looking closer at the life Sarah led up to that night, more mysteries came to light. Neighbors in her quiet Denver suburb described her as polite but distant. She rarely engaged in small talk, kept to herself most days, and maintained a spotless, albeit unusually minimalistic home. Some described her as secretive, almost like she was preparing for something. Documents obtained by police revealed a flurry of unusual financial activity in the months leading up to the crash. Sarah sold off nearly all her valuable belongings, the antique furniture she once prided herself on, rare first editions of books that lined her brightly lit study, even a custom-made Steinway piano she adored. The few remains of her inventory didn't even hint at sentimentality. Sarah had left behind nothing that told the story of a life she was proud of. If anything, it looked as if Sarah Middleton was erasing herself. It's almost like she was trying to disappear, Deputy Lena Parker mused to McCall while sorting through reports. You ever seen something like this before? Only in movies, he replied. McCall's mind raced with possibilities, but his gut told him this wasn't just a case of bad luck on a mountain pass. And then there was Jake. The investigation rapidly pivoted when it became clear that Sarah wasn't the only Middleton with secrets. Jake Middleton's background wasn't just checkered, it was outright criminal in some respects. His rap sheet included a handful of DUIs, a charge for illegal gambling, and several complaints of unpaid debts to shady groups in Las Vegas. When deputies reached out to Jake for formal questioning about his role as Sarah's life insurance beneficiary, they were greeted with excuses and stonewalling. Jake claimed he and Sarah hadn't spoken in over 2 years. I didn't even know I was on her insurance policy, he protested in a phone interview recorded by local police. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm devastated about Sarah, but I didn't ask for any of this. The veneer of Jake's innocence started to crumble when police obtained video footage from a traffic camera in Boulder, where Jake lived at the time. 2 weeks before the crash, Jake's beat-up Jeep Wrangler was seen pulling into Sarah's driveway late at night. Just days later, The same vehicle was seen leaving the town of Grand Junction, just a few miles from Dead Man's Pass. "There's no way this guy just stopped by for a family reunion," McCall muttered as he examined the footage. "He's up to his neck in this, I can feel it." Adding to the intrigue, investigators discovered that Sarah and Jake shared more than strained family ties. They shared desperation. Jake's gambling debts had ballooned to nearly $200,000 in recent months, facing threats from bookies known for ruthless enforcement tactics. Meanwhile, Sarah's bank accounts painted their own grim picture. Her checking account was completely drained, and her credit cards were maxed out. This wasn't just a case of financial mismanagement, this was a lifeboat with both siblings trying to avoid sinking. Then there was the final puzzle piece that shattered any illusions of coincidence: their communication records. Tracking Sarah's phone activity in the days leading up to the crash revealed frequent calls to a disposable burner phone, registered to none other than Jake Middleton. When questioned about these calls, Jake was surprisingly calm. "She was helping me out," he admitted during one police interview. "We had some debts, the family's debts, so she said she wanted to do something big, something real crazy to set things right. Honestly, I didn't even want to be part of it." His statement wasn't exactly a confession, but it wasn't far off. And so the threads of the Middleton siblings' lives began to unravel. Were they truly victims of cruel circumstance, or were they playing a deadly game of fraud that spiraled out of control? The truth was beginning to emerge, but for investigators, one thing was certain: Sarah Middleton wasn't the charred, lifeless victim the world thought she was. Identifying the body, unraveling the perfect scam. When Dr. Emily Carter, the county coroner, received the report of the Dead Man's Pass accident, she expected another routine autopsy. A vehicle crash in the Rockies wasn't unusual after all, and most cases fit the same tragic script: a late-night journey gone wrong, a lost driver, or someone taking a turn too sharply around the treacherous cliffs. But this wasn't just another body, and as Emily began her examination, the unraveling of a chilling, meticulously planned scam began. On her stainless steel work table lay the charred remains that had been pulled from the driver's seat of the smoldering SUV. The fire had left little more than scorched bone and brittle flesh. It was brutal. Emily had seen victims of fires before, it came with the job, but something about this one gnawed at her instincts. She couldn't place it at first, not until she began the careful analysis. The legal requirement for identification in such cases leaned on dental records. Luckily, Sarah Middleton's dental history had been provided within hours of the vehicle being identified as hers. The preliminary comparison yielded a match, or rather, what appeared to be a match. However, as Emily combed through the report, the first irregularity surfaced, one that would unravel what seemed like a tragic accident into a tapestry of lies. The autopsy revealed a curious detail. The victim's dental work included a molar filling that Sarah Middleton's chart didn't list. A simple mistake? It could have been missed. But Emily wasn't one to overlook irregularities, especially ones this obvious. She filed the inconsistency under needs further review, and proceeded with her examination. It wasn't long before more discrepancies came to light. The most glaring was physical stature. Emily, consulting Sarah Middleton's public records and driver's license, noted that Sarah was listed as 5'6". Her frame was slender, somewhere between 120 to 130 pounds. The body on the table, though charred beyond recognition, belonged to a person taller, approximately 5'7", and at least 15 pounds heavier. 1 inch may not seem significant to a layperson, but, to a coroner, it was a red flag. "It's biology," Emily explained later during her briefing with Sheriff McCall. "Bones don't lie, and they don't change height after death." "What does that mean?" McCall's brows furrowed as he stared at the coroner over his coffee mug in the station briefing room. "It means," Emily leaned forward, her tone steady but weighty, "this is not Sarah Middleton." The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the coffee machine in the background. Deputy Lena Parker, standing to the side, crossed her arms. "So what? We've got the wrong victim? Or—" Her words trailed off, her mind already chasing the darker implications. "Or we've got someone trying very hard to make us think this was Sarah," Emily finished. Beyond the height discrepancy, there were further inconsistencies that deepened the mystery. The victim's torso bore a surgical scar along the lower abdomen, consistent with an appendectomy, but Sarah's medical history showed no record of any surgery. Even more bewildering was the presence of a small metallic implant in the victim's left knee, possibly from a prior injury. Again, nothing in Sarah's known health records supported this finding. The woman Emily examined had lived a different physical story than the one Sarah Middleton's records portrayed. "Whoever she is," Emily stated, "she lived a harder life than Sarah. You can see it in the microfractures in her bones, consistent with repetitive strain. This was someone who worked on her feet a lot, maybe in manual labor." The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. Deputy Parker broke the silence. "Okay, so maybe it's not Sarah, but then how the hell did her SUV and her life insurance policy just happen to go up in smoke with this woman in her seat?" Sheriff McCall sighed, leaning into his chair. "That's the question, isn't it?" The ring and the golden clues. Two possessions remained mostly intact amidst the wreckage: a gold bracelet and a distinctive engagement ring, both melted only partially by the heat. Sarah's sister, Stephanie Middleton, had identified these items 2 days prior, during an emotionally charged visit to the mortuary. "This was her bracelet," Stephanie had said tearfully. "Our dad bought them for both of us when we graduated. She never took it off." The ring also offered a peculiar twist. With its unique, handcrafted design, a wide golden band tapering sharply to a slim point, it seemed impossible to mistake. "This," Stephanie remembered, caressing the twisted piece of jewelry. "This was from her ex-boyfriend. It's definitely hers." But Stephanie's certainty unraveled alongside the growing forensic questions. The bracelet, now recovered for further examination, bore traces of biological contamination. Skin oils and hair follicles fused into the metal from prolonged wear. When lab tested, the DNA didn't match Sarah's, further validating what Emily already knew. The body wasn't Sarah Middleton, a hired identity. The trail now led away from Sarah and toward the woman on the table. Sheriff McCall ordered a full-scale background search based on medical characteristics and skeletal features, while deputies began combing through missing person reports statewide. It only took 2 days before they hit a match in the Denver database. Jillian Reyes, a 36-year-old woman missing for 2 weeks. A migrant worker from New Mexico with no immediate family, Jillian matched the physical description, including the metallic knee implant discovered during the autopsy. "Homeless, vulnerable," McCall muttered under his breath as his team read Jillian's file in silence. She wouldn't have seen it coming. The narrative was starting to take shape. Not of a tragic accident, but of a deliberate orchestration. Jillian had been hired, or lured, and now Jillian was dead. Burned beyond recognition in Sarah Middleton's SUV, wearing Sarah Middleton's jewelry. Lena Parker's mind raced as she stared down at Jillian's photo. "Who does that?" she asked aloud, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Who goes this far?" McCall pushed his Stetson back, his face tight with restrained anger. "The kind of people who want to disappear without leaving a trail. The kind of people who think $5 million is worth a human life." As the pieces fell into place, the investigators found themselves confronting the growing shadows cast by Sarah Middleton's carefully cultivated image. Not the rising young author, not the local celebrity, but a ghost. A woman willing to trade someone else's life for her own escape. What began as a desperate plea for answers spiraled into something far more sinister. Detective McCall sat back in his creaky chair, staring at the growing board of evidence. This isn't just fraud, this is murder. While the remains of Jillian Reyes lay in the county morgue, investigators prepared to hunt down Sarah Middleton, the woman whose disappearance seemed less accidental by the hour. They had uncovered the first crack in her carefully constructed facade. The chase was on. Sarah Middleton still alive? Clues in Las Vegas. It was an otherwise ordinary night at Desert Springs Medical Center in Las Vegas. Ordinary in that it was filled with the usual chaos of a Las Vegas emergency room. Dr. James Barrett, an ER doctor well accustomed to patching up the city's casualties from late-night street fights, drunken escapades, and high-stakes gambling brawls, had just finished stitching up a particularly rowdy poker player when a nurse rolled a new patient into the intake room. The woman, petite and strikingly fragile, came in on crutches. Her left leg was awkwardly braced and she hobbled forward like someone who'd been trying to endure pain long beyond reasonable limits. The nurse explained that the patient had walked into the ER alone, declining ambulance services, despite what appeared to be a severe fracture in her leg. "I slipped in a parking lot," the woman said, her voice muffled behind oversized sunglasses and a scarf wrapped tightly around her head. "Stupid me! Just treat the leg, I've got somewhere to be." She leaned heavily on the counter, her breath shallow but impatient. Barrett eyed her suspiciously. Something about her demeanor was off. Most patients with her level of pain were either screaming or sobbing, but not this woman. She was composed, controlled even. more concerned about leaving than the treatment she needed. The nurse piped up. "She says she doesn't need pain meds, just an x-ray and a splint, but I'm telling you, Doc, the way she's limping, it looks worse, like fracture territory." Dr. Barrett nodded and motioned for the woman to take a seat. "All right, ma'am, let's take a look," he said. As she moved to the chair, he caught sight of something odd. Her fingers clenched the crutches so tightly that her knuckles turned white, not from exertion but from what appeared to be nervousness. She glanced at the nearest clock on the wall, an obvious tell for someone in a hurry. "Why the rush?" Barrett quipped casually as he examined her leg. "Vegas isn't going anywhere, you know." The woman didn't answer. She adjusted her sunglasses instead, pulling the scarf higher to cover most of her cheeks. "I just really need to get this done quickly." The tone wasn't pleading. It was controlled, firm, rehearsed. The first clue. When the X-ray results came back, Barrett confirmed the nurse's suspicion. A severe tibial fracture, the kind that typically required surgery if the patient wanted it to heal correctly. He entered the exam room holding the chart, still watching her closely. "What's the story, ma'am? This is more than a little slip in a parking lot." For the first time, the woman hesitated. She didn't meet his gaze, fussing instead with the hem of her scarf. "I told you it's fine," she said dismissively. "Just bandage it up or whatever you need to do. I'll be careful." Barrett frowned. "This isn't something you can just bandage up and be on your way. Without surgery, your leg could be deformed, and walking could become, well, a challenge." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, but her voice stayed cool. "No surgery." "Are you sure? Because I said no surgery." Her words weren't spoken harshly, but they ended the discussion. Barrett exchanged a glance with the nurse as they stepped into the hall. "Something's not right with her," he whispered. "People in that much pain don't act like they're here on a business deal." The nurse shrugged. "I mean, it's Vegas. Maybe she's running from an ex, a husband, a debt collector. You'd be surprised how many people come through these doors with secrets." "I get it. Secrets are everywhere here," Barrett said. "But what kind of person shows up with a busted leg like that? Tells us to skip pain meds, skip surgery, and just tape her up? Either she's insane or she's hiding something," the nurse finished for him. "The great disguise unravels." The mystery woman's reluctance would have been just another oddity in a city full of them if not for what happened next. Minutes after Barrett left her room to consult a specialist, an orderly came running down the hallway. "She's collapsed!" he yelled. The staff rushed back to her, finding her lying unconscious on the floor, her crutches sprawled out beside her. The scarf had fallen away during the fall, revealing a face far more striking than they'd noticed before. Slender jawline, high cheekbones, flawless skin even beneath the sweat beading from pain, and unmistakably, a face from the news. Barrett froze for a moment, racking his brain for where he'd seen her before. Then it clicked. He motioned for the nurse to grab the ER television remote. "Turn it to the local news," he said. As they worked to stabilize her, the screen flickered to reveal what he feared. A broadcast featuring the mysterious fiery car crash in Colorado. There in the corner, a photo of Sarah Middleton, prominent author, missing, presumed dead. One of the younger nurses gasped. "That's her! That's the woman they've been talking about all week!" Barrett stared hard at the screen, then back at the unconscious woman on the hospital cot. Well, alive doesn't look so missing anymore, does it? A slip of fate. Once the hospital staff pieced together the connection, they called local authorities, who confirmed Sarah Middleton's facial recognition matches through the Nevada law enforcement database. When she regained consciousness hours later, Sarah's first words weren't those of confusion but demand. "Where are my things? I need to go," she murmured. Her eyes flicked nervously around the room, catching the gaze of every officer stationed outside her door. Dr. Barrett leaned close. "You're not going anywhere, Miss Middleton. Or, should I say, Sarah Middleton? You have a lot of people looking for you." Her face, pale and gaunt from pain and exhaustion, turned cold. Her lips curled into something halfway between a smirk and a grimace. "Do you even know who I am? What you're talking about?" she said weakly, but mockingly. "Yeah," Barrett replied dryly. "The dead woman walking, and judging by that leg of yours, not walking anytime soon." Sarah Middleton's plan with her brother, a perfectly crafted scheme. To understand how Sarah Middleton, a rising author with a spotless public image, orchestrated one of the most chilling and intricate fraud schemes in modern history, you have to start with Jake Middleton. Jake wasn't just her older brother. He was a man hardened by years of bad decisions, fast money, and the fallout of living on the edge of legality. Together, the two siblings weren't just united by blood. They shared desperation, the ultimate motivator that tied their fates together in a plan both brilliant and grotesque. The birth of the idea. The plan was born 6 months before the accident. Sarah had called Jake late one night, her voice sharp but quiet, peaking with an urgency Jake hadn't heard since they were kids sneaking out of the house. "Jake," she whispered, keeping her hand cupped over the phone, as if someone might already be listening. "I need your help. I can't do this anymore." Jake, 7 shots deep after blowing his last few dollars at a slot machine in a backroom casino, groaned. "What are you even talking about, Sarah? You're the successful one, remember?" "No, Jake, it's not what it looks like," Sarah snapped. Her tone was uncharacteristic of the composed woman everyone else thought she was. "The book sales are tanking. The advance for my next novel is gone. I used it to cover some mistakes. I'm broke. And they're coming after me." "Who's they?" Jake shot back, now slightly more interested. Sarah hesitated. "People I borrowed money from. They're not exactly legal." There was a silence on the line thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake exhaled sharply, realizing his sister's high and mighty facade had crumbled. Finally, he spoke. "All right, you're screwed. I'm screwed. What do you want from me?" And that's when Sarah said the unthinkable. "Insurance money. We create an accident, get the payout, and I disappear." Jake blinked hard, the neon lights of the bar flickering around him. "You're out of your goddamn mind, Sarah. That's illegal? Yes. Crazy? Maybe. But you and I both know nobody's going to suspect me. I'm the golden child. And you, well, let's be honest, they'll think you're too much of a mess to pull something like this off." Despite his initial disbelief, Jake's mind started to churn. He wasn't stupid. Years of hustling and skimming money off shady dealers had taught him one thing. The best scams are the ones where nobody sees it coming. And Sarah, dressed in her prim designer blouses and sporting her polished Denver success story, fit the mold of someone nobody would suspect. "All right," Jake finally said, "but if we're doing this, we do it right." Mapping out the logistics. The first hurdle was the insurance policy. Sarah's existing life insurance wasn't enough. It needed to be significant, something worth vanishing for. On Jake's advice, Sarah set everything in motion to double her policy with Madison Insurance Group, citing future family planning as her reasoning. She made Jake her sole beneficiary, a move she justified to the broker as wanting to help her baby brother get back on his feet. The lie was sweet, innocent, carefully calculated. Meanwhile, Jake dug into the more unsavory parts of the plan, securing a replacement body. This was the part that made Sarah squirm, but Jake wasn't nearly as troubled. Life on the streets had hardened him to the realities of desperation, and he knew exactly where to look to find someone who could match Sarah's physical characteristics. "That's the beauty of this city," Jake had joked during a meeting at a downtown diner. "Vegas is full of ghosts, people who could disappear tomorrow and nobody would even ask where they went." For weeks, Jake trolled homeless shelters, bars, and bus depots. Finally, he found Jillian Reyes, a 36-year-old migrant worker who had no immediate family and an uncanny resemblance to Sarah. Jillian was vulnerable, and more importantly, perfect for their plan. "I'm gonna give her a warm bed, a good meal, maybe a couple $100 on the side to sit in your car for a few hours. She'll never even know what's coming," Jake assured Sarah. Sarah's voice was icy on the phone. "Just make sure we're not linked to her. I don't want this blowing back on us." Executing the plan. In early February, the wheels were set in motion. Sarah meticulously deleted records of her own life. She sold her car, liquidated valuables, and funneled small amounts of cash into a hidden offshore account. She told neighbors she was downsizing to refocus on her writing. To everyone else, she painted the picture of someone chasing simplicity, a relatable, almost saintly explanation. The night of the crash, everything came together. Sarah and Jake lured Jillian into the SUV with the promise of a quick job. Jake offered her money to drive a car out of state for him. Once Jillian was inside, she never had a chance to rethink her decision. Jake slipped her a drink spiked with tranquilizers, rendering her unconscious before she even hit the mountain pass. At Dead Man's Pass, Jake staged the vehicle. He set the brake loose, letting the car roll just enough to make it look like a crash. Then gasoline and an accelerant did the rest. Flames roared up the mountainside, erasing any hope of identifying Jillian for who she truly was. Sarah, parked in a rental car half a mile away, watched it all unfold through the rearview mirror. "It's done," Jake said, calling her moments after dumping the SUV over the cliff. Sarah exhaled, teeth clenched. "I'm not going to thank you for this." Wouldn't expect you to, Jake replied. But don't forget, you owe me when you're sipping martinis on some beach in Mexico. A perfect plan. Almost for weeks things went exactly as planned. The police identified the vehicle as Sarah Middleton's. Jillian's remains, burned beyond recognition, became the unwitting stand-in for a woman presumed dead. In the aftermath, Sarah quietly disappeared, moving through the Nevada desert with forged documents and a wig in her luggage, while Jake stayed behind in Denver to play the grieving brother. But no plan was perfect. Jake's arrogance began to crack under pressure. Bragging to old friends about retirement money raised suspicions, while Sarah's decision to seek medical attention after her leg injury lit the match that would burn their scheme to the ground. The fallout begins. "You had one job," Sarah hissed into the burner phone after her hospitalization. "Keep quiet and stick to the plan." "You think this is my fault?" Jake shot back, his voice filled with venom. "You're the idiot who couldn't keep her damn scarf on in the ER. Not exactly master of disguise, are you?" The fallout from Desert Springs Medical Center was immediate. When authorities connected Sarah to the crash, they didn't just stop with her, they came for Jake, too. His fingerprints on the accelerant canister and burner phone records tied him directly to the crime. The plan, flawless in theory, had unraveled spectacularly. Sarah and Jake were no longer desperate siblings chasing a second chance. They were fugitives. The wrong time for the truth to emerge. Sometimes it's not the weight of your lies that brings you down. It's a single tiny slip at the worst possible moment. For Sarah Middleton, that moment came just days after she thought she'd successfully vanished into thin air. A fractured tibia and a quiet emergency room in the heart of Las Vegas became her undoing, unraveling months of meticulously planned deceit. What began as a brilliant scheme disintegrated into chaos, all because of an unplanned injury and an overworked ER doctor who happened to be more observant than most. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. After staging the fiery SUV crash near Dead Man's Pass, Sarah had carefully begun her escape. Her new identity, a forged driver's license under the name Christine Doyle, was cleanly prepared. Her movements were calculated, traveling by bus through smaller terminals to avoid extra attention. By the time she arrived in Las Vegas, nestled among bright lights and constant noise, she thought she was just another face in the crowd, impossible to pick out in the chaos of the city. But luck wasn't on her side. A sudden accident. The accident was stupid, even by her own admission. She'd slipped while rushing across a poorly lit parking lot on the outskirts of the Strip. The adrenaline she carried with her from weeks of evading capture made her jumpy. She didn't see the slick patch of oil on the asphalt until her foot gave way beneath her. The sickening crack of her tibia snapping echoed in the alleyway as she crumpled to the ground. "Shit, no, she whispered to herself, clutching her leg. She could hardly breathe, her fractured bones screaming in protest every time she even shifted slightly. Limping to the road, clutching walls for support, she considered her options. Calling for help was a terrifying thought, but what choice did she have? This kind of injury wasn't something you could walk off. When she finally hobbled into the emergency room at Desert Springs Medical Center, she prepared herself to play the role of a nobody, a quiet drifter trying not to raise suspicion. But that broken leg was the beginning of her downfall. A watchful-eye Dr. James Barrett, tired but sharp, wasn't the kind of doctor you could fool easily. When Sarah refused pain medication, wouldn't give much information about herself, and declined appropriate surgical treatment, red flags went up immediately. People in pain didn't act like they were on a schedule that didn't allow for hospital visits. And then there was her appearance. Oversized sunglasses covering half her face, a scarf wrapped clumsily to obscure her jawline and most of her hair. "Are you running from something?" Barrett asked her casually after reviewing her x-rays. "No, I just don't want to waste time on all of this," Sarah shot back, her tone strained but clipped. "Just wrap it up so I can get out of here." But Las Vegas had a way of spotlighting disguised truths. She may have planned her escape with meticulous care, but she hadn't planned for the kind of attention a fracture like hers would attract. Refusing surgery for such a severe injury wasn't something Barrett could accept without pushing back. "I don't mean to tell you how to live your life, but if this isn't treated properly, you're asking for permanent damage," he said, his tone steady, but probing. He was fishing, trying to understand what kind of person could remain so calm in such pain. Sarah didn't flinch. "I'll take the risk," was all she muttered. It was the collapsed fall that did her in. Only moments later, after hobbling out of the exam room, Sarah fainted in the hallway from a combination of pain and exhaustion. The scarf she'd so carefully used to obscure her face fell away, revealing more than she would have liked. Barrett, already suspicious, stared down at the unconscious woman as recognition dawned. He'd seen her face before, not in person but on the TV in the break room, a missing persons report out of Colorado tied to a fiery crash. Sarah Middleton's photograph had flashed across his screen earlier that week. "She isn't dead," Barrett whispered to himself as nurses rushed to assist her. But she sure as hell wanted everyone to think she was. Piecing it together. By the time Sarah woke up, Barrett was no longer holding his suspicions silently. He'd called security and flagged local authorities. They streamed into the ER within 30 minutes, placing her under quiet observation while running her photo through facial recognition systems. The results came back swiftly, and damningly. Sarah Middleton was alive, hiding in plain sight, barely 100 miles from Nevada's border. When she realized what was happening, that the officers milling outside weren't just dealing with random hospital cases, her mask finally slipped. "Where are my things? I have to go," she said hoarsely, trying to push herself up. Dr. Barrett leaned over her bed, meeting her panicked eyes. "Not so fast, Sarah. Or should I say, Christine Doyle. You've got quite a story to tell, but I wouldn't plan on going anywhere for a while." She didn't respond right away. Her chest heaved, breath shallow, as beads of sweat trickled down her forehead. Finally, with all the exhaustion of someone carrying the weight of too many lies, she muttered, "You have no idea what you're talking about." "No?" Barrett wasn't buying it. "Then why does the missing woman on TV look just like the so-called drifter with a broken leg sitting in front of me? Same face, same hairstyle before you tried to wrap it in a scarf? Same story, if you can call making no sense a story at all?" Sarah gave him a look filled with venom, but stayed quiet. She had been caught in the one place she hadn't anticipated, the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. The arrest. The moment the authorities entered her room, guns holstered but badges visible, Sarah let out a defeated sigh. She didn't resist. She was too tired to muster up a fight, too injured to attempt an escape. They read her rights and asked questions she already knew she wasn't going to answer. Everything about her posture screamed resignation. And with that, the perfect plan, the staged crash, the death, the $5 million payout in life insurance, came crashing down. One moment of bad luck on an oil-slicked parking lot had unraveled months of effort, tying her back to a crime she thought she had escaped. But if Sarah's capture was bad, what came next was worse. When police dug into her burner phone records and found ties to another suspect, a man named Jake Middleton, her older brother, the floodgates opened. Any hopes she might have had of pinning her disappearance on a simple misunderstanding were obliterated. Now it wasn't just her life insurance fraud being scrutinized, it was the possibility of a deeper, darker crime that brought an innocent woman to a fiery death in a smoldering car. As Sarah sat in the back of the police cruiser under the neon glow of the Vegas Strip, she couldn't help but think, of all the places in the world, it had to be here. In the city of luck, hers had just run out. The hunt for Jake Middleton, the elusive accomplice. When Sarah Middleton's carefully crafted facade crumbled in the Las Vegas ER, the shockwaves rippled far beyond Nevada. The news of her arrest didn't just headline local papers, it lit a fire under federal and state law enforcement agencies desperate to unravel the truth behind the fiery crash at Dead Man's Pass. If Sarah was alive and hiding, it begged the question, where was her brother, Jake Middleton, the man authorities now believed was more than just a grieving sibling? He was, in fact, Sarah's co-conspirator. But Jake was no ordinary fugitive. He was a ghost. Vanishing act. The moment Jake learned of Sarah's capture, he didn't hesitate to act. Somewhere in a rundown motel on the edge of Albuquerque, New Mexico, Jake sat hunched over an ancient burner phone, his teeth grinding nervously as local news played faintly in the background. The anchor's voice was sharp with intrigue. Author Sarah Middleton, declared dead at the scene of a Colorado car crash, has been discovered alive in Las Vegas after an apparent attempt to conceal her identity. Jake didn't listen to the rest. His mind raced. He'd never trusted Sarah to keep her cool under pressure, and now her slip-up had jeopardized everything. His fingers trembled as he dialed another burner phone number, the kind of number that didn't have a name attached to it. Just a faceless string of digits he kept memorized for emergencies like this. "We've got a problem," Jake muttered into the receiver. The voice on the other end was rough, gravelly, and used to bad news. "How big?" "Think nuclear. She's alive. She's talking." A long pause. "You need to disappear." "I'm already ahead of you," Jake growled, throwing a duffel bag over his shoulder. stuffed with cash, burner phones, and enough forged IDs to fool even the most diligent small-town sheriff. Jake's escape plan was a finely tuned machine. After years of shady dealings and brushes with the law, he knew exactly how to slip through the cracks. By the time authorities realized Jake was missing from his registered address in Boulder, Colorado, all they found was an empty apartment filled with fast food wrappers, broken furniture, and zero clues. Jake Middleton had vanished. The chase begins. Deputy Lena Parker's boots echoed against the concrete floor of the Denver police headquarters as she paced back and forth, a fresh report clutched in her fist. "He knew we were coming, someone tipped him off," she spat, slamming the folder onto Sheriff Ethan McCall's cluttered desk. McCall leaned back in his chair, his Stetson tilted lazily over his forehead, but his calm exterior hid an inner focus. "You give a guy like Jake Middleton a 2-day head start, and it's like chasing smoke," he said. "The guy's been running his whole life." "Yeah, well, he can't run forever," Lena shot back, gesturing toward a map pinned on the corkboard across the room. Red string-connected dots stretching from Colorado to New Mexico and beyond. "We know he's been spotted in Albuquerque. A dirty bartender said he paid cash and kept asking about rideshare drivers who don't ask questions." That was 2 days ago. McCall sat up, grabbing a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. "What are the feds saying?" Lena exhaled sharply. "They're all over the financials. Jake's burner phones pinged near a Western Union in Arizona yesterday. He withdrew just under $10,000 under the name John Melton, but we're guessing he's got more aliases stashed away. Well, let's hope he doesn't have friends left in low places." McCall turned his attention to a grainy surveillance photo of Jake exiting a convenience store, his head low, a ball cap hiding most of his face. "Because that's where we're gonna find him." Desperate moves. While investigators raced to connect the dots, Jake kept moving. From Albuquerque, he hitched a ride to Tucson, Arizona. Gone were his expensive suits, his slicked-back hair, and his aura of a Vegas player. Now he sported an unkempt beard, oversized sunglasses, and an air of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. But Jake was running low on time and resources. He knew the key to staying ahead of the authorities was cash, lots of it, and cash meant risk. Pushing his luck in dusty, off-the-grid towns, Jake began frequenting pawn shops, trading in stolen electronics and counterfeit Rolex watches for whatever money he could scrape together. One clerk, however, remembered him. When questioned later, the man would recall Jake's nervous demeanor. "I figured he was just another drifter, but he kept looking over his shoulder like someone was after him, sold me a fake Rolex. Hell of a convincing fake, though." Closing the net, Jake's luck ran out in El Paso, Texas. A tip from a gas station attendant, someone Jake had inadvertently rubbed the wrong way by trying to shortchange, alerted local sheriff's deputies to a suspicious man at a nearby motel. By the time law enforcement arrived, Jake had already slipped out, leaving behind his duffel bag and a discarded burner phone. "We're getting warmer," Deputy Parker said, her voice crackling over McCall's radio as she sped down the freeway, chasing reports of a hitchhiker matching Jake's description spotted along Route 62. McCall stayed calm, his years of experience reminding him to keep emotions in check. Remember, he's dangerous. If he feels cornered, he'll lash out. The final break in the case came less than 24 hours later. As Jake tried bribing a long-haul truck driver for a ride to Mexico, the driver stalled long enough to call Border Patrol agents. Surrounded just miles from the Texas-Mexico border, Jake made one last desperate attempt to flee, darting toward the desert in the dead of night. But in the end, his knack for escape wasn't enough. 2 agents tackled him to the ground, handcuffs snapping into place as he shouted obscenities into the empty air. Justice catches up. Deputy Parker arrived at the El Paso Sheriff's Office just in time to see Jake being hauled into a holding cell. His face was bruised, his shirt torn, and his once cocky grin had been replaced by a glare dripping with resentment. "About time," Parker muttered, locking eyes with him through the bars. "You've been running long enough, Jake," Jake smirked, leaning back against the wall with feigned ease. "You got me. But good luck proving half of what you think I've done. Sarah's the mastermind. I'm just the guy who carried the bags." Sheriff McCall stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Save it for the judge. You and your sister thought you could cheat the system, burn someone alive for a payday?" His eyes narrowed. "The system's about to chew you up and spit you out." Jake didn't reply. He simply leaned his head back, staring at the fluorescent light above him as the reality of his capture began to sink in. The chase was over, and all Jake Middleton had left was time. Time to think about how it all went so terribly wrong. Would you like me to extend this section into Jake's court proceedings or even flashbacks of his role in the crime? There's so much more depth we could explore here. Let me know your thoughts. Behind the Veil, Sarah's criminal past uncovered. When the investigators began to dig deeper into Sarah Middleton's life, they weren't just looking for clues about her current crimes, they wanted to understand what had pushed a seemingly successful author, the darling of Denver's literary scene, into orchestrating a deadly scam. As they peeled back the layers of her carefully cultivated public image, a much darker picture began to emerge. It turned out Sarah Middleton wasn't as squeaky clean as she seemed. In fact, this wasn't her first brush with fraud and deception. Her journey into criminality had started long before the fiery car crash at Deadman's Pass, the first red flag, college days. Long before Sarah was a rising literary star, she was just another ambitious student at the University of Colorado Boulder. She majored in English literature and spent countless hours in coffee shops, poring over classic novels while scribbling poetry in the margins of her notebooks. On the surface, she was the quintessential college dreamer. Her professors described her as intelligent and driven, but there was another side to Sarah that few knew about. At the time, Sarah was juggling multiple part-time jobs and dealing with mounting student loans. Money was tight, and Sarah, ever resourceful but morally flexible, found an easy way out. Investigators unearthed her involvement in a small underground operation forging student IDs for fake age verification. Sarah had learned her way around Photoshop and high-quality printers, and before long she was churning out fake IDs for her peers to use at bars and clubs. What started as a way to help some friends and make quick cash quickly escalated into a well-oiled operation. A former classmate interviewed by police described Sarah's nonchalant attitude about the scheme. She was cool about it, the classmate recalled. It was almost like a joke to her, like, who cares, it's not hurting anyone. She made a ton of money, though. I don't know how she never got caught. Although the operation eventually fizzled when Sarah graduated, her knack for deception, and her ability to justify small crimes, never disappeared. If anything, it became the foundation for something much more dangerous down the road. A taste for forgery. Years later, when Sarah was struggling to establish herself as an author, financial pressures once again pushed her toward morally gray territory. Investigators uncovered evidence linking her to another fraudulent scheme, this time involving fake autographed books. In the early days of her career, Sarah frequented literary conventions and book fairs, making a name for herself as a passionate literature lover and amateur collector. She'd often buy rare, collectible editions of popular novels claiming they were investments. Only, Sarah wasn't just buying and reselling books. She had started forging signatures of famous authors from various decades, passing the books off as signed first editions. With her sharp eye for detail and deep knowledge of book markets, Sarah was able to con unsuspecting buyers out of thousands of dollars. Whether it was a Hemingway signature here or a Tolkien autograph there, Sarah's fakes were almost good enough to fool the experts. In one of the most damning revelations, a former colleague from a Denver bookshop where Sarah had worked part-time came forward to provide insight into her methods. Sarah would always talk about how authenticity is subjective, the colleague said. I remember one time she showed me a signed copy of The Catcher in the Rye that looked perfect. I asked her where she got it, and she just smiled and said, "A little creativity goes a long way." I didn't think much of it back then, but now it all clicks. The profits Sarah made from her forged books were modest compared to her later crimes, but the scheme gave her an intoxicating sense of control. She was perfecting the art of blending truth with lies, of manipulating people's trust, and of profiting from deceit. It wasn't just about the money, it was about power, debt, and desperation, the financial web. By the time Sarah published her first successful novel, Whispering Pines, her literary career seemed to be taking off. But what the public didn't know was that Sarah was already drowning in debt. According to investigators, her forgeries and side hustles were no longer enough to sustain the lifestyle she wanted. Between unpaid credit card bills, defaulted loans, and a series of bad investments, including the failed attempt to self-publish a novel that flopped, Sarah's life was spiraling out of control. Court documents revealed she had opened 5 credit cards under fake names to cover her expenses. The scheme worked for a while, but when her creditors began catching on, Sarah's house of cards started to collapse. Desperate for a fresh start, she even faked financial hardship to scam eviction relief during the pandemic, claiming she had lost all income due to canceled book signings, a lie investigators later found was completely fabricated. Sarah was always playing the victim, a former acquaintance said when reached for comment. She had this way of spinning every setback in her life into a story where she came out looking like the underdog. It's honestly impressive how she kept so many lies straight for so long. The first arrest. In perhaps the most shocking discovery, Sarah had already been arrested once before her infamous staged death. Several years prior, while attending a writer's retreat in upstate New York, Sarah was caught trying to defraud a prestigious grant program. Police records showed that she had submitted multiple applications under fake aliases, listing fabricated works and plagiarized material to increase her chances of being selected. When the retreat organizers found out, they reported her to local authorities. The arrest didn't lead to jail time. Sarah's lawyer managed to negotiate a deal that allowed her to complete community service in exchange for a reduced sentence. The incident was quietly swept under the rug, and thanks to her charismatic personality, Sarah managed to rebrand herself as a repentant creative who simply made a regrettable mistake. Few people outside her inner circle ever found out about the crime, a pattern of manipulation. Though these early schemes might seem small compared to her later plans, investigators began to see a clear pattern in Sarah's life. She was a habitual manipulator, someone who used her charm and intelligence to bend situations to her will. Fraud wasn't a hobby or a desperate last resort, it was her comfort zone. She wasn't just running scams out of necessity, she thrived on the thrill of outsmarting the system. Sheriff Ethan McCall, who had been leading the investigation into Sarah's staged death, summed it up best during a press briefing. This wasn't her first scam, and it probably wouldn't have been her last if we hadn't caught her. Sarah Middleton spent her entire life perfecting the art of deception. She's not just a criminal, she's a chameleon, someone who can change her story, her image, and her identity in the blink of an eye. That's what makes her so dangerous. Unraveling the mystery. As word of Sarah's criminal past began to spread, public opinion turned sharply against her. The woman once celebrated for her talent and wit was now exposed as a fraud who had built her career and her life on a foundation of lies. For the investigators, understanding Sarah's history wasn't just about building the case against her. It was about answering the bigger question: how did someone like her fall so far? And perhaps even more chillingly, had Sarah ever truly been the person the world thought she was? Or had she always been the villain hiding in plain sight? The final end: Jake arrested, Sarah faces the death penalty. In the sprawling saga of Sarah and Jake Middleton, the conclusion was as tragic as it was inevitable. What began as a daring scheme to cheat the system ultimately unraveled into a nightmare, one marked by betrayal, desperation, and the ultimate price of their crimes. When the dust settled, Jake found himself behind bars, while Sarah, the mastermind of the operation, was facing the gravest possible punishment, the death penalty. Their fall from grace wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a reckoning years in the making. Jake's arrest, the end of the line. Jake Middleton had spent weeks on the run, crisscrossing the Southwest in a desperate bid to stay ahead of law enforcement. But his luck, like his sister's, was bound to run out. Surrounded outside of El Paso near the Texas-Mexico border by police, sheriff's deputies, and border patrol agents, Jake didn't go quietly. "Step away from the vehicle, hands in the air!" officers shouted as Jake emerged from the motel parking lot, disheveled and hunched over with a duffel bag slung across his shoulder. A bag they would later discover contained thousands in cash, half a dozen burner phones, and a handful of fake IDs. Jake froze for a brief moment, eyes darting around as though calculating his last chance at escape. But there was no way out this time. As agents advanced, Jake made a break for it, sprinting toward the fence that marked the edge of the motel grounds, but he didn't even make it 50 yards before two officers tackled him to the ground. He thrashed, shouting expletives and incoherent ramblings about being set up, but it was no use. Jake Middleton was finally in custody. Inside the holding cell that evening, Jake sat in sullen silence, glaring at the walls around him. He knew this was the end. The cocky bravado he'd maintained for years had all but disappeared. When questioned by the police, Jake tried to paint himself as the unlucky accomplice, a pawn in his sister's master plan. "Sarah was the brains," he said, leaning back in his chair, his face shadowed by the dim interrogation room light. "All I ever did was follow orders. I didn't want any of this. She roped me in, said it would help us both start fresh." The detectives listened without much reaction, but they weren't buying it. Jake might have played a supporting role in his sister's criminal exploits, but his actions painted a clear picture of someone fully complicit. From helping stage the crash to acquiring the accelerants to his illicit financial dealings in the aftermath, Jake's fingerprints were all over the plan. "Jake, you're not the unlucky schmuck in this story," one detective finally said, his tone cold and deliberate. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You helped burn someone alive in a car to fake your sister's death. That's not just following orders. That's murder. Jake's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he had no rebuttal. Sarah's trial, the mastermind unmasked. If Jake's storyline ended in a dim-lit cell, Sarah's unfolded under the glaring spotlight of national attention. The trial of Sarah Middleton became one of the most high-profile cases in recent history, not just because of the gruesome nature of her crimes, but because of the sheer audacity of her plan. To many, she symbolized the hubris of someone who thought they could outsmart the world. To others, she was a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution built an airtight case, outlining Sarah's actions with precision. They painted her as a manipulative mastermind who had spent years honing her skills as a liar and a con artist before escalating to murder. They argued that Sarah's crimes went beyond fraud, that she had cruelly and callously sacrificed Jillian Reyes, an innocent woman, to ensure the success of her scheme. She didn't just fake her death, the lead prosecutor thundered during the closing argument, pacing the courtroom with fire in his voice. She orchestrated the murder of a vulnerable, homeless woman. She planned every detail, down to the flames that would destroy any trace of the victim's identity. Sarah Middleton didn't just want to escape, she wanted to erase her old life, no matter the cost. And that cost was the life of Jillian Reyes. Sarah's defense team tried to argue that her brother Jake was more involved than Sarah let on, claiming that he had become the enforcer in the plan, pushing Sarah toward taking fatal steps she may not have considered on her own. But even Jake himself, when interviewed on the witness stand, didn't offer much help for his sister. "You want the truth?" Jake said bitterly, shackled at the wrists, glaring across the courtroom toward Sarah. "We both came up with the plan. My hands are dirty, sure. But Sarah's the one who never flinched. She's the one who burned that body." The courtroom fell silent. Sarah didn't react. The verdict and sentencing. The jury deliberated for less than 3 days. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdict came swiftly and with the weight of finality. On the charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of insurance fraud, we find the defendant, Sarah Middleton, guilty. Sarah showed no outward emotion. She sat still, her polished appearance carefully maintained, a stark contrast to the chaos she had wrought in so many lives. If she was broken inside, she didn't let the cracks show. For her crimes, Sarah was sentenced to death, a rare penalty in cases of white-collar crime accompanied by murder. The judge didn't mince words during the sentencing. "Miss Middleton, you orchestrated a crime of staggering cruelty and cunning," the judge said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You took a life without remorse, all to escape the consequences of your lies. For that, this court sentences you to the ultimate punishment, death by lethal injection." While the sentence divided public opinion, many felt it was a fitting conclusion to the case. Sarah had spent her life deceiving others, but in the end, she couldn't deceive justice. Jake's fate, a life of regret. Meanwhile, Jake Middleton avoided the death penalty but wasn't let off lightly. He was convicted of second-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple related charges. With a sentence of life in prison without parole, Jake was shipped off to a maximum security facility in Colorado, where he would spend the rest of his days reflecting on everything he had lost. Not just his freedom, but whatever remained of his relationship with his sister. "She used me," Jake told a prison interview journalist years later. "I used her too, don't get me wrong, but Sarah? She was always 2 steps ahead, always thinking about herself first. I don't know how I didn't see it back then, or maybe I did and I just didn't care." Jake spent most of his time behind bars alone. Letters to Sarah went unanswered. It wasn't until his later years, when illness began to overtake him, that he admitted to another inmate. "This is what we were always headed for. We were too greedy, too goddamn arrogant to see how this would end." The legacy of their crimes. Sarah and Jake Middleton left behind a trail of devastation. Jillian Reyes's memory was honored by advocacy groups who rallied for better protections for vulnerable populations, while their case became a blueprint for teaching law enforcement how to spot and prevent fraud-based homicides. As the date of Sarah's execution drew closer, the world debated who she truly was. Was she a villain born, or had desperation turned her into one? While some argued that her intelligence and wit could have taken her far on the right path, others saw her simply as an unrepentant mastermind who had gambled with lives and lost. But one thing was clear. Despite years of deception, Sarah Middleton and her brother Jake ultimately couldn't outrun the truth. A 2-decade manhunt for a killer. The story of the Middleton siblings wasn't the only investigation heating up in the 2020s. In parallel to unearthing the crimes of Sarah and Jake, law enforcement agencies had been quietly piecing together another chilling case, one far older but no less haunting. It was a case spanning over 2 decades, shrouded in shadows and silence, involving a killer who thought he had perfected the art of vanishing. His name was Ethan Blake, a man whose name alone would strike terror into the hearts of anyone who lived in Texas in the early 2000s. Ethan Blake had been a phantom, a predator who escaped justice through an uncanny ability to blend into crowds and reinvent himself. Every lead grew cold, every search effort met a dead end, but in an era of rapidly developing technology, his 2-decade-long reign of anonymity would finally meet its end in a way even he hadn't anticipated. The first crime, a night in 2000. It all began on the humid, restless night of June 14, 2000 in Austin, Texas. Ethan Blake, a 27-year-old drifter with a history of petty crimes, had been seen loitering near the University of Texas campus hours before a devastating murder that would earn him national infamy. Kathleen Meyer, a 21-year-old junior majoring in environmental science, was found dead in her off-campus apartment the next morning. The details of her murder, brutal, calculated, and deeply personal, suggested one thing: her killer knew exactly what he was doing. The immediate aftermath of Kathleen's death was a swirl of panic. The media dubbed the unknown offender the Austin Phantom for his terrifying ability to leave behind almost no trace. There were no fingerprints, no weapon, and no clear witnesses. The only piece of evidence, a partial boot print left in a mixture of mud and blood near Kathleen's back door, was too vague to point to any specific suspect. At the time, Ethan Blake wasn't even on investigators' radar. A drifter with no fixed address and a knack for flying under the radar, he slipped out of Austin days after the murder, leaving behind nothing more than a few unpaid motel bills and a fake ID. The years of silence. For years, the case stagnated. Without new evidence, it became one of Texas's many unsolved homicides, gathering dust in a forgotten corner of police archives. But Ethan Blake hadn't stopped. Over the next decade, law enforcement would later uncover, he moved state to state, using aliases and false identities while leaving behind a trail of subtle, disconnected crimes. Small burglaries, assaults, and in the rare moments he felt bold enough, murders. Blake's method was simple but effective: strike quickly, leave no trace, and never stay in one place too long. He thrived on America's vastness, using it to disappear whenever suspicion came too close. From Louisiana to Oklahoma to Nevada, he reinvented himself as a truck driver, a handyman, a bartender, never staying anywhere longer than 6 months. But technology was beginning to close the gaps that Blake relied on. Camera systems became standard in every corner store, luggage terminals implemented better security measures, and forensic science advanced in ways that would seem like science fiction in the early 2000s. Most crucially, facial recognition technology, still in its infancy during Kathleen's murder, had become a potent tool in the arsenal of law enforcement. The breakthrough: a face in the crowd. It was in August 2019, nearly 2 decades after Kathleen's murder, that Ethan Blake's luck began to run out. He had been passing through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, heading for what authorities believe was a new identity in Mexico or South America. Blake had underestimated the quiet but sweeping role that facial recognition technology now played in major American airports. A camera embedded discreetly near the baggage check-in captured Blake's face for a fraction of a second. The system flagged it almost instantly, matching it to an encrypted database of high-priority unsolved cases in the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP. His image was linked to a composite sketch used in a secondary investigation in Arizona in 2008. Another unsolved murder authorities hadn't yet tied to him. The system alerted a small, specialized department flagged for both violent crime suspects and persons of interest who routinely crossed borders under false identities. This time, luck wasn't in Blake's favor. Chasing a ghost. By the time authorities closed the net on the Dallas airport, Blake had already sensed something was off. His long years of staying just ahead of law enforcement had fine-tuned his instincts, and it was likely an offhand glance from an undercover TSA officer that tipped him off. With nothing but a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he ostensibly changed his mind and walked away from the terminal moments before authorities could corner him. What followed was the beginning of one of the most intense manhunts in recent FBI history. For months, Blake managed to evade pursuit, retreating into the underbelly of society with his characteristic discipline and resourcefulness. He made no digital footprints during this time. No credit card purchases, no phone calls, not even a stolen vehicle that could be traced back to him. He knew better than anyone how to disappear, said one FBI profiler assigned to the case, but the longer Blake stayed hidden, the more determined authorities became, closing the noose a mistake in Montana. Blake's downfall, much like Sarah Middleton's, came not from police brilliance alone, but from his own human error. In early 2020, while attempting to cross into Canada near Glacier National Park, Blake slipped up. Physically exhausted and perhaps overconfident in his ability to blend in, he stopped at a small-town Montana diner for coffee and food. A local sheriff happened to be seated at the counter, chatting casually with the owner. The sheriff noticed two things that immediately seemed off. First, Blake paid his bill using extraordinarily worn, nearly unusable cash, avoiding eye contact with the waitress. Second, when the sheriff later observed the dining room security camera footage, he noticed Blake giving inconsistent answers when asked simple, friendly questions. After Blake left, the sheriff ran the plates on his rusted old truck. The plates didn't match the registration for the make and model, and Blake hadn't realized he was wearing boots that left a distinctive impression in the muddy parking lot. FBI agents were called in to investigate the mismatch, and the resulting database match confirmed what authorities had been searching for: the capture of Ethan Blake. It didn't take long for federal agents to track Blake to a remote, dilapidated hunting cabin where he had been hiding. When they arrived, armed and ready for a standoff, Blake didn't resist. Authorities found him sitting alone at a small wooden table, flipping through pages of a worn Ernest Hemingway novel. "About time," Blake said calmly, setting down the book when they entered. His face, weathered and gaunt, betrayed no expression of fear or remorse. Even as officers cuffed him, he didn't flinch or fight. It was as though he had made peace with the inevitability of capture after 2 long decades of running. Justice, finally. In the years since his arrest, Ethan Blake confessed to multiple crimes spanning from 1998 to 2019. While he initially denied involvement in Kathleen Meyer's murder, DNA evidence, finally cross-referenced decades later, sealed his fate. The Austin Phantom had been unmasked at last. Blake's trial captured national attention, with survivors' families finally receiving some semblance of closure. Kathleen's parents sat in the front row every day, their grief etched in their faces as Blake's hollow confessions played out in court. In 2023, Ethan Blake was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. His capture marked not just the end of a haunting 2-decade mystery, but a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice and the advancements in technology that tore down the facade he had spent years building. Modern technology brings every truth to light. In an era where technology operates at the forefront of everyday life, the line between freedom and accountability has become razor thin. The captivating tales of Sarah Middleton, Jake Middleton, and Ethan Blake revealed one undeniable truth about the modern world. No matter how clever or calculated a criminal might be, modern technology will find a way to expose them. From facial recognition systems in bustling airports to forensic algorithms capable of solving decades-old crimes, the sophistication of modern tools has transformed the way justice is served. For investigators, technology is no longer just an enhancement to their work. It's the backbone of criminal investigations, capable of seeing through deliberate deception and unraveling complexities that would have once crippled even the most seasoned detective. The convergence of data, AI, and cutting-edge forensic science was the real hero in exposing the darkest truths of these elaborate crimes. Facial recognition, watching, analyzing, recognizing. The days of grainy sketches and eyewitness accounts as primary cornerstones of investigations are long gone. Today, cameras don't just record, they analyze. Facial recognition technology, bolstered by AI, has emerged as one of the most potent tools in law enforcement's arsenal. Sarah Middleton's story is partly a testament to the weight of that power. While she walked confidently through bus terminals and crowded city streets, under the impression that her wig and false driver's license were enough to make her invisible, she didn't account for the quiet, watchful eyes of pervasive facial recognition networks. Though her eventual arrest came in the form of a slip at an emergency room, the quiet work of background systems like municipal camera grids and public transit surveillance had already flagged her movements between Colorado and Nevada. In cases like that of Ethan Blake, facial recognition technology was even more pivotal. One fleeting moment in front of an inconspicuous airport camera proved to be his undoing. For years, Blake had evaded federal agents by meticulously disguising himself, changing identities, and erasing his digital footprint. What he couldn't erase, however, was his face, a literal unchanging signature that became his ultimate downfall. Modern facial recognition systems operate on precision unmatched by even human instinct. Algorithms identify unique facial markers, from the curve of an eyebrow to the spacing of nostrils, even in distorted or partially obscured conditions. The more universally this technology integrates into daily infrastructure, like security checkpoints at airports or even convenience store cameras, the less room criminals have to maneuver. Its accuracy has transformed the idea of watchful eyes from an old metaphor to a modern, inescapable reality. DNA and forensic breakthroughs, the silent truth tellers. Forensic technology is no longer limited to the basics of fingerprinting and fieldwork. Instead, it operates at a microscopic level, decoding molecules and reconstructing evidence far beyond human capabilities. DNA technology in particular has undergone such massive innovation that it's not only used to convict present-time criminals, but to also solve cold cases, some of which date back decades. Ethan Blake likely thought he had escaped justice for Kathleen Meyer's murder in 2000. After all, the case had stagnated for years, stuck in a pre-digital age with only vague bootprints and empty leads to speak of. But time and technology were never on Blake's side. Advances in DNA technology offered a second chance at unraveling Kathleen's story. Kathleen's case, without realizing it, had left traces behind. The forensic data from her old crime scene sat idle in archives, waiting for technology capable of deciphering what it encoded. Decades later, modern genetic sequencing techniques allowed investigators to match the minute traces of DNA found in Kathleen's apartment to Ethan Blake's biological profile, conclusively linking him to the crime. This wasn't mere intuition or guesswork, this was science, unraveling truth one microscopic thread at a time. And forensic breakthroughs don't stop at DNA sequencing. Bloodstain pattern analysis has been automated to reconstruct crime scenes digitally, while touch DNA technology, capable of extracting DNA from seemingly insignificant points of contact, like skin cells left on a doorknob, has empowered investigators to pick up trails where they might have ended before. Technological advances like these not only serve to convict criminals, they also help exonerate the innocent, giving justice the sterile hands of science, a truth untainted by human bias. Artificial intelligence, the thinking partner that never sleeps. Artificial intelligence, AI, has become the detective that never tires, incapable of burnout or human error. In the cases of both Sarah Middleton and Ethan Blake, AI-driven analysis played quiet but crucial roles in exposing their crimes. From parsing thousands of surveillance videos for patterns of movement to predicting likely future actions based on past behaviors, AI has become the ultimate partner for law enforcement. Consider Sarah Middleton's run through terminals, motels, and bus depots. While agents tailed her on the ground, a digital infrastructure bolstered by AI was already piecing together fragments of her trail. Her ticket purchases left behind transaction codes, and her false identification left digital signatures traceable through deep learning algorithms trained to identify anomalies in behavior. AI spotted patterns humans wouldn't have. Why was a woman with no local connections casually shuttling between her so-called new home in Nevada and her old haunts near Colorado? The program flagged inconsistencies following the breadcrumbs Sarah hadn't even realized she was leaving behind. Ethan Blake's movement across borders highlighted the full potential of AI systems in tracking criminals with long, fractured histories. They don't just monitor real-time actions but cross-reference them with data from unsolved cases, finding correlations between even the smallest indicators. A fingerprint here, an unregistered vehicle there, AI threads it all together into a seamless web. While Blake moved under the cover of darkness, AI tirelessly connected the dots, narrowing his world until escape was no longer an option. Surveillance systems, the 21st century witnesses. The silent stars of criminal justice today are the myriad of surveillance systems that record the daily lives of millions of people. Tools like license plate readers, thermal camera networks, cell phone triangulation, and digital footprints have revolutionized investigations. Jake Middleton, for all his bravado, didn't suspect that his beat-up Jeep Wrangler would become a beacon pointing directly at him. Automatic license plate readers detected his outdated registration moving suspiciously close to major crime locations. When combined with cell tower data from his burner phones, investigators quickly mapped out Jake's seemingly random, zigzagging movements across multiple states, a detail he thought made him difficult to pinpoint but instead created a forensic net that detailed where and when he'd been, every step of his desperate flee. In the end, surveillance is not just about watching, it's about contextualizing. Modern systems don't just capture isolated stills, they interpret, isolate patterns, and provide a continuous living narrative that even the most inventive criminals can't outmaneuver forever. The future of technology and crime. As the stories of the Middletons and Blake demonstrated, the golden age of undetectable crime has officially ended. While modern criminals adapt to technology, so too does law enforcement. The race between the hunted and the hunters continues, but with tools like satellite imaging, AI-enhanced behavioral profiling, and predictive policing on the horizon, the odds have tilted dramatically in favor of justice. The question society faces is dual-edged. On one hand, the omnipresent nature of digital oversight feels like a necessary safeguard in a world full of deceit. On the other hand, it raises questions about privacy, autonomy, and how far systems should reach into everyday life. But one thing is unmistakable. The truth, no matter how buried or encrypted, has become far harder to elude. From the spark of fire in Sarah Middleton's web of lies to the decades-long pursuit of Ethan Blake, technology didn't just expose the truth, it held it under an unflinching spotlight for the world to see. Lessons from greed and grim consequences. The tangled, tragic stories of Sarah Middleton, Jake Middleton, and even Ethan Blake aren't just chilling accounts of criminal behavior. They're living parables of human greed, the dangers of deception, and the inescapable hand of justice. Their actions left behind a trail of destruction, broken lives, haunting memories, and a legacy stained with betrayal and blood. Yet, beyond the courtrooms, autopsy reports, and police sirens, their stories hold profound lessons for society as a whole. Lessons that remind us of the fragility of morality and the devastating cost of unchecked ambition. Greed knows no bounds. If there's one thread that ties together Sarah and Jake Middleton's dramatic downfall, it's greed. Greed for money, greed for success, and greed for power. It's a theme that echoes through countless stories of criminal ambition. But the Middleton siblings took it to a level so extreme that it cost another human being her life. Jillian Reyes, an innocent, vulnerable woman, became nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game. Her life was cast aside in the name of financial gain, her identity burned in a staged car crash that was as callous as it was calculated. Sarah's greed wasn't a sudden development. It began as a slow slide, a string of small moral compromises that grew into a full-blown disregard for life and law. A forged ID in college? No big deal. A fake signature in a rare book? Justifiable. But the problem was that each step made the next crime easier to justify. By the time Sarah was planning her own death and the destruction of Jillian's identity, her moral compass had been so thoroughly broken that the enormity of her crimes didn't seem to faze her. The lesson here is an old one, but it bears repeating. Greed doesn't just consume, it corrupts. It doesn't matter how bright, intelligent, or successful someone appears on the surface. When greed takes root, it can turn ambition into obsession and dreams into nightmares. Sarah and Jake's story is proof that no amount of money is worth the weight of a ruined soul. Desperation breeds destruction. Jake Middleton's role in his own undoing wasn't just about greed, it was also about desperation. Jake wasn't the brains of the operation, but he was its brawn, its enabler, and in some ways, its most tragic figure. Drowning in gambling debts and caught in a cycle of losing and borrowing, Jake latched onto his sister's plan as his only lifeline. He didn't see another way out, and for that, he paid the highest price possible. Not just a life sentence, but a lifetime of regret. Desperation has a way of clouding judgment, and Jake is the perfect example of someone who didn't think beyond the short-term fix. Every decision he made, helping Sarah choose Jillian, sourcing the accelerants, fleeing from law enforcement, was rooted in survival, in clawing his way out of the pit he dug himself into. But ultimately, his desperation led him down a path where even survival became impossible. This part of their story teaches us the importance of foresight. It's easy to convince yourself that one unethical decision will solve your problems, especially when you feel cornered. But desperation only leads to more desperation unless you confront the root of the problem. Jake's story is a harsh reminder that taking the easy, immoral route often leads to consequences far worse than the problems you were trying to escape. The ripple effect of crime. One of the most haunting aspects of the Middleton saga lies in the damage their greed and desperation caused to innocent people. Jillian's death was undoubtedly the most tragic, but she wasn't the only victim. There were ripples of pain that spread far beyond what the siblings likely anticipated. For Jillian's friends, her disappearance and death led to years of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. For her family, though Jillian was portrayed as alone, distant relatives later emerged. It was a wound they would carry forever, a reminder of how society failed her in life and death. And then, there were the countless others who felt the shockwaves of the Middleton fraud, the insurance companies left to pick up the pieces, the townspeople who felt betrayed by once familiar faces, and the investigators who had to sift through grim details to ensure justice. The lesson here? Crime never exists in a vacuum. It's never just about the person committing it. Every choice, every action sends ripples into the world, affecting lives that were never meant to be part of the story. When those choices are rooted in greed and deception, the ripples become tsunamis, leaving devastation in their wake. The inescapable truth: crime always comes to light. Perhaps the most ironic part of Sarah and Jake's story is how much effort they put into escaping justice, only to have every detail of their crimes laid bare for the world to see. Sarah meticulously planned her fake death, erasing her identity and orchestrating her rebirth as someone new. Jake, on the run for weeks, thought he could outrun law enforcement. Together they believed their cunning and resourcefulness would keep them untouchable. But they were wrong. The advancement of modern technology, from forensic breakthroughs to AI-driven facial recognition, meant that their plans were doomed from the start. Jillian's identity, painstakingly erased, was reconstructed using DNA evidence. Sarah's trail of false documents and burner phones was unraveled by algorithms capable of spotting inconsistencies no human could. And Jake's zigzag escape route, traced with detail he could never anticipate thanks to surveillance networks and digital footprints. Their story proves a hard truth. The age of undetectable crime is over. In a world where every action leaves a trail, digital, biological, or otherwise, there's no such thing as escaping justice. The only real choice is whether to live a life that stands up to scrutiny or one that crumbles under it. A lesson in humanity's duality. At its core, Sarah and Jake's saga is a tale of humanity's dual nature, the capacity for brilliance and the capacity for destruction. Sarah wasn't a simple villain. She was sharp, intelligent, and capable of great creativity. But those same traits, when warped by greed and ambition, became weapons for deception and harm. Similarly, Jake wasn't born to be a criminal. He was shaped by years of bad decisions and mounting desperation. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far would we go to protect ourselves? At what point does ambition become dangerous? And how do we ensure that intelligence and creativity are steered toward building, not destroying? Ultimately, the Middleton tragedy isn't just a story about crime, it's a story about choice. No one is born greedy, desperate, or malicious. But the choices we make, the lines we cross, and the compromises we justify, those define whether we move closer to good or evil. Legacy of lessons. As the world watched the trials, sentences, and consequences unfold, the lessons of Sarah and Jake's lives became glaringly clear. They became a case study in how not to live, a warning to anyone who thinks they're too smart, too careful, or too powerful to be caught. Their faces, once symbols of success and family ties, are now reminders that actions have consequences and that greed is a hunger that grows until it consumes you completely. For Jillian Reyes, the true victim in their story, advocacy groups have worked to ensure her name isn't forgotten. Campaigns for vulnerable populations, homeless women, exploited workers, have risen in her memory, a sliver of justice in an otherwise tragic tale. And for everyone else watching, there's one undeniable takeaway: greed, desperation, and deceit are paths that lead only one way: toward destruction.